All right, so what I want to do is talk about media and aggression, think about this social learning theory, kind of think about media and aggression as a whole, and present a little bit of information to you. Okay, so let's kind of walk through this. And we can start first with thinking about, well, what are some of the factors in media depicted homicides that might lead them to be modeled? Okay, so when we watch behaviors on TV, okay, these shows where someone's killing someone else, what then potentially caused that behavior to be modeled? Okay, so we see this in some situations of actual violence, where teenagers, individuals maybe with mental health issues, those who have been harmed or ostracized might start demonstrating or acting the same way as what they see in terms of these TV shows. And part of what makes factors more likely to be repeated in terms of aggression from TV shows is if that behavior is modeled, if it's made exciting, okay, it's perceived as real, and it's culturally justified. And I think one of the strongest examples of this is actually heavyweight prize fighting, okay, or boxing itself. We see that if we look at boxing, okay, boxers are rewarded. Okay, so successful boxers, those that are knocking out their opponent, those that are winning consistently, are rewarded in terms of bigger fights that have bigger purses, so larger winnings. Okay. They're given higher esteem. Okay, we see more in terms of seeing all the things that they've won, big houses, stuff like that. It's made exciting by the fact that it's all kinds of activities that go on with the fight, the pomp and circumstance. It's made exciting by having the audience cheers, the boxers are fighting each other, there's commentary that's go along with it. It's perceived as real. In this case, you can imagine being in the fight yourself. Okay, you can even think about video games that are associated with kind of boxing and things like that. And it's seen as culturally justified as it's kind of part of this American way, kind of part of our inherent culture. Maybe Freud would say this is part of that Thanatos drive that we have. And we see that we can make the argument that it does lead to aggression because across the US, homicide rates actually increase following highly publicized prize fights. If you remember watching the Super Bowl, you likely noted that in between all the $1 million commercials that were carefully crafted, there were several commercials about domestic violence. And part of why that's happening is that they saw after during Super Bowl games that violence against women increased. And the argument here is that it follows well with this social learning in media where you see this aggression being rewarded. Players are getting money, greater commentary for hitting the other player harder. It's exciting, it's the Super Bowl. It's perceived as real because, again, you can imagine playing football, maybe you played flag football or something like that, and it's culturally justified as being kind of this American sport. And so you can see that there's research suggesting that things that are depicted in the media, especially if they have these criteria being rewarded, made exciting, perceived as real, and culturally justified, then lead to increased aggression outside of these contexts. But one of the things that's interesting to consider with this is that in Japan, they have explicit violence and nudity on TV, okay, even within cartoons, especially thinking about anime, but they have a low violent crime rate. Okay, so I just made the argument that just simply watching a prize fight, a boxing fight, is something that's going to cause aggression in others who are watching this. But we see that in Japan that that's not the case. Okay, so now we have a little bit of a conflict between the two. How can this be? How can we see kind of very different responses, okay, between American culture versus Japanese culture? Okay, so what would be some explanations you could have for why we see aggression being modeled in the United States, but not in terms of Japan, even though we might say that their media is more aggressive or more violent?
Because if you go back to like the factors that lead them to be modeled, it's not like anime isn't necessarily perceived as real, and it's also not necessarily justified by their culture, I feel like, because it's not perceived as real.
Okay.
So like even though the behaviors in anime, like in the TV shows, might be rewarded and they might be exciting, they're not perceived as real. So I feel like that takes away from people wanting to model that behavior.
Okay, so at least if we stick with anime, which I think is a good one to think about, that you're absolutely right. It's not seen as realistic. Okay, so it's not seen as behavior that they could replicate. And that was one of the key pieces that you identified from the beginning of class in terms of when individuals act in aggressive ways, if they see that behavior as being real, that aggression that they're modeling is being real. other explanations thinking through this critically. So that's a great starting place. Other ones that we want to add to why we see this difference between cultures.
I'd say in in Japan it's not glorified or rewarded.
Okay, all right, and that's exactly one of the explanations that we have. Okay. So in this case, offenders are not rewarded. Okay, so there's no additional award or higher status for the aggression. I think the big piece here is that the consequences of violence are shown; they're not ignored. Okay, so I was a big fan of Castle, the TV show. Basically, every episode of Castle started with someone dying right away. So it was either someone that had already died, this gruesome death, or they caught, like they showed what happened. And when you see that, okay, we always saw the victim, and then they were trying to understand what happened and how that person committed the crime and things like that. But they very rarely showed then the funeral of the person that died in that initial attack. They very rarely showed the implications of it. If they did, it was kind of fleeting, where they were interviewing the husband of the wife that had died because he was a suspect. It wasn't, in terms of sympathy or anything like that. And so part of what we see here is that empathy becomes a key variable. So part of this is that people who are trained in empathy are less likely to aggress to others. And part of what happens with our social learning and media, and part of potentially the difference, is that there's a bigger empathy component potentially in Japanese culture, which is more collective, more concerned about how others are doing, compared to more the individualistic culture that we have, where we want to stand out. Maybe through being more aggressive, we are unique and we stand out a bit more. Now, we can say that, hey, there's a lot that goes into media and violent media. There's a lot of debate that we could have. If we were in the classroom, we would do a debate related to this. So I want you guys to kind of process what we talked about in terms of the research that you know about, in terms of your own experiences. Okay, well, I will say one thing that happens, and Brad Bushman's highlighted this before, is that he'll present facts and research related to social learning, media, and violence, and then his counterpoint will be someone who plays violent video games, and they'll declare that they're not a violent person. Okay, so one of the things that happens is that, it's violent video games get tied to killing someone else, actually committing homicide. And in fact, someone commits homicide, it's less than 0.001% of the population, or something even smaller than that. So it's not something that violent media is directly related to that high level of aggression. But we're going to talk about some levels of aggression that we see when we process kind of the general aggression model. We talk about outcomes of aggression kind of in this lab context. Okay? So let me pause here before we get into our next big piece, which is talking about this general aggression model. This would be a good one for us to be processing to work on here. So the general aggression model, and I know I apologize for moving quickly, but hopefully you guys are picking up what we need to. Again, this is recorded if you want to go back through a specific part. The general aggression model in this case is really kind of the standard of where social psychologists are at in terms of understanding aggression. It's not the only way to understand aggression by any means, but it's one that gets focused on the most. And it starts to incorporate a number of different aspects into that process that goes through individuals deciding to become aggressive or not. So the idea here is carrying out aggression is based mostly on knowledge structures. Okay, so the scripts we talked about, which are created by social learning. So we can unpack that first part. We know scripts are kind of ways to act in certain situations. We develop these scripts for all kinds of different contexts, such as simply going to a restaurant and ordering. We know these schemas too are these mental shortcuts. And the idea is that these mental shortcuts start to get developed by socially learning. Okay, so you start to see the world around you, see how aggression is demonstrated. And so because of this, we start to develop that in certain contexts, we can use these scripts, these schemas that are aggression-based to act. And where this starts to come is it starts to think about this in terms of this input. Okay, so we start with an input of both the person and the situation. Okay, so the person and the situation are not unique to us at all. We've been talking about this all semester. Okay, so the person in this case may be related to what they've learned. It might be related to their personality, their genes, violent media consumption. And that then interacts with the situation. So is that situation one that's prompting aggression? Is it a situation that's inducing frustration? Because frustration does lead to aggression. It's not always leading to aggression, though. Is the situation one that's, it's hot, it's warm, it's unpleasant, it's crowded? Okay. Maybe you have the opposite of being, quarantined, so you're away from others, you're not getting those social connections. And they say, well, let's look at the person, the situation, and how that then affects kind of this internal state. Okay, so now we're kind of in this roots perspective here. So we know that our affect, our cognition, and our arousal levels are all going to influence our response. Okay, so our affect, how negatively we're feeling, how unpleasant we're feeling, okay, how hurt we're feeling. Our cognition, the way that we're thinking about that situation, are we thinking about it in terms of positive ways? Are we thinking about it in terms of having negative thoughts overall? And our arousal level, are we a higher state of arousal? Okay, we're kind of agitated to begin with. And each of these factors are going to influence each other. Okay, so the person might be someone who's aggressive. The situation might dictate aggression. But if they're in a good mood, they might say, well, I don't want to lose that good mood by being aggressive, so I'm not going to affectively respond negatively. These routes then, okay, influence then this outcomes. Okay, so you start to appraise the situation and you make decisions on how you want to behave. Okay, so you can take this information of how you're feeling, the internal states caused by this person, situation, interaction, and you decide, well, is this a situation where I want to respond aggressively? So this might be an impulsive action, or is it that you're going to evaluate what's going on and be more thoughtful, more careful in terms of how you're responding, potentially avoid that aggression, or at least kind of, moderate that aggression. This is then going to lead to how you respond in that social encounter, and they argue, Bushman and Anderson and others, that then this feeds back into the situation. I mean, we kind of have a loop here. And obviously the loop will end when someone acts in a way that reduces that aggression doesn't occur. Okay, so it's a bit more of a complex model than we've been looking at throughout the course of the semester, but this person situation you guys are well versed at. We've talked about these internal states in terms of the way we think about situations, our affective response influencing, and this biological piece. What's new here is kind of the appraisal of the situation. Okay, how that person's evaluating what's going on, and how that then influences their action response. Again, that feeds back into the encounter. All right, so let's unpack this a little bit more. Okay, and this will be kind of the last piece that we'll talk about here. So we see that within these biases, some of these roots, that we have inner biases that lead to aggression. So one of the things is that our inner biases that we may expect others to act aggressively. Okay, so that's where our cognition piece comes in. You're in a situation, it's unclear what's going to happen. Your cognition, your first thought is that other person is going to harm me. Maybe I need to harm them first. That cognition, that mind frame also comes in to say the ambiguous situations where it's unclear what happened might be seen as aggressive. I forget to include you in on a group interaction to let you know the date of something. If your cognitions, if your affect are more hostile, you might perceive that as being an aggressive act. Okay, so I've known how to happen myself. I say, oh, they did that intentionally, or like, they did that because they really didn't care. And I was kind of upset or frustrated with something. And then when I get out of that cognitive mind frame, I go, oh, well, they likely just forgot. Or, I realized I wasn't really clear about wanting help with that. Maybe that's what happened. They also assume when someone does something to hurt or harm them, that it was deliberate. Okay, so keep in mind that people may harm you, but the intention wasn't there. They weren't trying to do this. Okay, but your cognition here is to assume that everyone's trying to harm you. The other thing too is that this catharsis thought still stays with people. Aggressive people assume aggression will make them feel better. Okay, so if I act on this aggression, if I harm this other person, then I'll feel better, we'll resolve this situation quickly. We can kind of get through this as fast as possible. So we again see that our thought processes, our affective response, our heightened arousal all starts to lead towards these inner biases potentially coming out. And so what we're going to do on Thursday is we'll talk about some examples of this general aggression model. It's actually some of my favorite research to talk about. We'll then make the switch into our last topic, talk about pro-social behavior. Again, we'll have the day to work on that. Let me pause to see if you guys have any questions. I'll hang around at least for a little bit in case there's something I can help you out with. But I hope this is a good lecture for you guys. You're picking up on things. I know we covered a lot of ground, but I think it's something you guys will grasp well. Again, the exam will be kind of weighted more towards stereotyping and prejudice than aggression and pro-social, considering we spent a little more time with that. So let me pause at this point to see if you guys have any questions. All right. I super appreciate you guys being here. Continue to work really hard on things. Appreciated all the engagement today. I will hang around just for a little bit in case you have questions. Otherwise, if you don't, I will see you guys on Thursday.